Well, good Shabbos and welcome. This is Torah study for a Shabbos afternoon, a Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Feinstein, Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California, joined as always by my dear teacher and friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman of South Florida. Good Shabbos, Marc.
Good Shabbos, my friend. How are you, Eddie?
We are trekking through the book of Bamidbar, trekking through the wilderness, and we're about to leave Mount Sinai today. And just before we leave Mount Sinai, there's a series of disparate laws. I think these are the very, very last traditions and laws that Moses is going to give us, because in the middle of this Torah portion, we're leaving Sinai and beginning the trek through the wilderness toward the promised land. And the first of these disparate, interesting laws is the law of the Menorah. So Moses is commanded, you will remember, to create a meeting place between God and the people. Mishkan, a dwelling place for God within the people Israel. It is a tent covered by a cover, surrounded by a sort of fence, as it were, a sort of cloth fence. And before it are a number of accoutrements. And one of those accoutrements is something familiar. It is the menorah. It is the candelabrum that will bring light to this thing. According to the book of Exodus, it is a 7-branch candelabrum decorated with flowers and fruits and nuts. So it sort of looks like a tree of life that we light up and carry that as a light of God's presence wherever we go. In synagogues everywhere, there is a light over the bima called the Ner Tamid, which is a remembrance of that particular light. And it is a really interesting sort of object when you think about of all the things that God would command Moses to create. Why a menorah? Why light? And in particular, why this particular kind of candelabrum? Marc, I know you've thought about this a lot. You spoke about it on the holidays. Talk to us about the menorah.
Yeah, it's strange because of all the other clay kodesh, these sacred objects, every one of them is a tool. You know, the altar is a tool for sacrificing animals. The Aron HaKodesh is a tool. It's a box to hold the 10 Commandments. The kior, the wash basin, made of mirrors, that's a tool to help the priests in their ablutions before their sacred duties. Alone among all of the objects on the Temple Mount, the menorah is not a tool, it's a symbol. And when you look at Judaism, there aren't that many symbols. There aren't that many symbols in Judaism. A lot of people, if you ask them what's the symbol of Judaism, they'll say the Star of David. And, you know, it's certainly buoyed up by the fact that on the flag of the state of Israel, there's the Star of David. What people don't realize is that the Mogen David, the Star of David, was an ancient pagan symbol until the 12th century. And the only authentic symbol in the entire history of Judaism is the menorah. And in Israel, although the Star of David is on the flag, the sign of the state of Israel is the menorah. And opposite the Knesset, there's a picture of a sculpture of the ancient menorah. And we even have an ancient version of it in the Arch of Titus in Rome, which the Romans took the menorah in 70 when they conquered the temple. And they took it and they inscribed it on the frieze above the Arch of Titus. And for many years, it was forbidden for Jews to walk underneath the Arch of Titus because there's a phrase underneath it that says Judea captor in Latin, which means Judea is captive. And it was such a sign of despair and oppression and failure and defeat that Jews were not allowed to walk under it. And then in a great symbolic act that a lot of people are unaware of, in 1948, when Israel was declared a state, Jews walked under the Arch of Titus the other way, from west to east. It's toward Jerusalem, as if to say, it's not going to happen again. So the menorah is our universal symbol. But when my teacher, Nelson Glick, taught me about it, he said, Marc, the phrase here, Beha'alotcha, is odd because it says, Deber el Aaron v'amarta alim Beha'alotcha, the beginning of our portion. When you light et hanerot al mul pnei menorah, when you light the lights, and it says al mul pnei menorah, opposite the face of the menorah. Very awkward grammatical syntax. It should be Beha'alotcha et hanerot al menorah. But it says, don't light the lights on the menorah, light them opposite, sort of facing the menorah in a way. And he said, my interpretation of that is that the menorah, which had a single post, which, by the way, was the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, and 3 branches on either side. He said to me, I believe that they swiveled on the central branch, the central post. And so you could swivel the menorah branches, and you could either view them face on or edge on. And if you viewed them face on, you saw 7 separate lights. And if you viewed them edge on, you saw one single brighter light. And he said, that's what I think we must do in Judaism. That's what you must do in your rabbinate. You must swivel the menorah. It's enough for us to see the differences between the 7 branches, the different denominations in Judaism, Israel and the diaspora, all the internal divisions. It's enough with that. What you need to do is see the single brighter light that only happens when you swivel the menorah. And it's ironic that my work with Tom Hartman was all about that, but not just in Judaism. We said we know enough about how we're different, not enough about how we're all the same. So my work with him was swiveling the menorah. And you've done such brilliant work about that as well, teaching people that we have to look at how we are all the same, how we are unified. The rabbinic saying, Israel v'orai tachadhu, Israel and the Torah are one, they're single. And the other thing which I have learned so much from you about is the image of light. So those are my initial thoughts about the menorah. We need to swivel it to see the single greater light.
Well, let's pursue this because I want to pursue that image of light. So the Torah portion is very self-consciously introducing the idea that we're leaving Mount Sinai and we're entering the wilderness. Okay, that's already an interesting symbol, right? An interesting comment that the Jewish people will live in the world. We won't live on a mountaintop where God, or a mountain where God is. We're going to live in the world. And it begins then our life in the world, our life with the peoples of the world, our life meeting the challenges of the world. We're going to carry a menorah. We're going to set up a candelabrum, right? And so Isaiah, the prophet, is going to tell us that we are Or LaGoyim. We are a light to the nations of the world. That's the same fundamental symbol. Light, however, let's just focus on that for a moment. The whole beginning of the Shacharit prayer service, the morning prayer service, as the rabbis give it to us in the tradition, is a meditation on light. It begins with the bracha Yotzer Or Uvorei Choshech, God who creates light and creates darkness, and it ends with the bakasha. It ends with the petition Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, let a new light shine upon Zion. And it's all these different meditations on light. So why light? Of all the things that one could have, of all of the different images, of all the different metaphors for spiritual life, why light, Marc? What does light represent?
Well, light is the most fundamental way that we imagine God in the world.
Mhm.
I mean,
I see the light, you say, right?
yeah, and we say Torah ora,
Right.
and we even use the word which carries through in English and in Hebrew of enlightenment.
Hmm.
Torah ora.
Hmm.
The Torah is a light, it enlightens us. So, it's the way we perceive the higher truth of our lives.
Hmm.
And I
I
think
think, yeah,
the
it's
Isaiah
interesting.
quote is really strong,
Right.
because if you look at it carefully, it's not, I've chosen you to be orot legoyim, lights to the nation, which
Hmm.
would make sense. It's, I've chosen you to be an or legoyim, a light to the nations. So there's some also contained within the image of light is the notion that a single light is more powerful than divided lights.
Hmm. I'm interested in this idea that light as an image to me is very powerful, because I was thinking about this at Hanukkah time, right? Watching my kids light Hanukkah candles. So you have the shamash, the candle that's the lighter, and you touch it to the next candle and you light that candle, but the first candle isn't diminished. That is, light in a certain way can be divided without being diminished. Um, so
Very nice.
it carries an interesting quality of those. And then the other piece about light that's interesting is you can't see light. You can only see what light shines upon. So it's a very interesting metaphor for things spiritual, for a whole set of realities which we experience and we know, but are different than the material realities, the stuff that's around us, right? You can see an object, but light, you have to see it when it shines on something, right? So love in the same way. You can't see love, but you can see when love shines on something. Wisdom, you can't see, but you can see when it's applied to the lives that we live in. It's a whole set of spiritual realities that that we're familiar with, that we live with all the time, but we don't often think about them. So Moses begins this Torah portion by saying, you're about to enter a different world. You've been here at Mount Sinai. You're isolated from the world. You're in the presence of divinity. Your whole life is devoted to divinity because there's this giant mountain in front of you that represents God's presence in you. Now I'm going to send you into the world. Now you're going to go live in South Florida. Now you're going to live in Southern California. Now you're going to live all over the world. I need you to carry with you some image, some metaphor for the divinity that you have been endowed with. And that's the menorah. That's the symbol that I want you to carry. And it becomes, as you said, the six-pointed star is relatively late. It's the 17th, 18th century.
Yeah.
The menorah becomes the perennial symbol of the Jewish people. It's what you find in all the illuminated manuscripts of medieval texts. It's what you find over the doorpost of the oldest synagogue in Europe at the Alta Neuer Shul in Prague. It's what you find across the street from the Knesset and on all of Israel's money. Well, then later in this Torah portion, Marc, we're going to leave Mount Sinai. In chapter 11, or at the very end of chapter 10, we're going to get the marching orders, which we're all familiar with because we chant them when we take the Torah out of the ark. Vayihi binsoa ha'aron vayomer Moshe kuma Adonai v'yafutzo evecha. When the ark would move, Moses would sing this song, and then when the ark would rest. And then in chapter 11, we take literally one step into the wilderness, and guess what happens? Guess what happens? The people start to kvetch.
Yeah.
The people we haven't heard a good kvetch from the people of Israel for quite a while. The people start to kvetch. They don't like the food. They don't like the conditions. They don't like the marching. It's such a bitter, awful image of the people of Israel. And what makes it even more poignant, and this is what I want to ask you, the kvetch is familiar to us because fundamentally it's the same kvetch that we heard back in the book of Exodus when we first left Egypt. They didn't have enough water. They didn't like the food. They were afraid of where they were going. So we have a set of kvetches in Exodus, a set of complaints, a set of rebellious thoughts in Exodus. We have this gargantuan experience of meeting God at Mount Sinai. And now on the other side of the mountain, as we begin the journey back, the journey once again toward Canaan, toward the promised land, we have the same set of kvetches, the same set of complaints. So here's my question, my old teacher friend. Why is this here? Why such an ugly, shall we say, or unfortunate image of our people right in the center of our sacred scriptures, right? When I go through that, we used to have a thing called photographs. You remember photographs? You used to take pictures of your kids on vacation
On
and then
film.
on film, and then you take them to the drugstore and they would develop them.
And you get one good picture out of 100.
Exactly. And you take out the ones where the kids are cross-eyed and making rabbit ears, and you'd only put into the photo album the really nice ones. How come we didn't do that? How come we put these very ugly pictures of ourselves into the family photo album of the Jewish people? Tell me this.
Well, the reason is that there's two levels of truth. There's the truth that can be spoken and the truth that can be learned. And the rabbis say, just as it is a mitzvah to teach what can be learned, it is also a mitzvah not to teach what cannot be learned. And what you have here is a Torah whose consequence, if it's observed, is total human flourishing on planet Earth. But its challenge is that it requires us to overcome all of our animal instincts and our petty cravings and our jealousies and our kvetches. And that is not possible for us to do in our animal nature. So the problem with the whole Torah, the problem with the image of light and all of it, is that it's being taught to people who are partly spiritual and who can learn it, and partly animal who cannot learn it. And that's the challenge. But I think light is the perfect image to give us hope that we can learn it, because light is what unifies us ultimately. Light is what gives growth to the earth's vegetation. Light is what gives us the Torah and the idea that we're made in the image of God. And my favorite image of light comes from Rosh Hashanah in the Mishnah Rosh Hashanah 2:4, where we read, Me'ayin masayin masuod, Mehar mishcha l'sartaba, misartaba l'gorfina, ma'aleh morid, ad asher nireh agola kamud eish gadol, which is, where do they begin to raise the torches to announce the coming of the holidays, the new year? From the Temple Mount, right at the Temple Mount, they would raise and lower a torch. And then Sartaba, which is a mountain right over near the Mount of Olives. From Sartaba to Gorfina, that's a little further out in the north, raising and lowering the torches twice until the entire diaspora appears to be a single great pillar of fire. That's the hope. You see, that if we all watch for the flame on the other hilltop, if we all are attentive to the light that's shining from different mountaintops, the end result is that we will be a single unified diaspora with a single greater light. It's like swiveling the menorah.
Exactly.
It's another way to say it.
But I want to push just a little harder for a moment. the image of our people in the 11th, 12th chapters of the book of Numbers, which is where we are today's Torah portion, is such an ugly image, right? The people come to him twice. They come to him, they don't like the water. That's the first problem. But then they don't like the food. They want meat. And the contrast
Garlic. They want garlic.
and they had it for free in Egypt. Do you remember how wonderful Egypt was? They started talking about all the things we had in Egypt, how there was a midnight buffet with a chocolate fountain and marshmallows,
And a
and
beating chicken liver heart.
and it's so ugly. Here is Moses, who introduces them to God, offers them this exalted, transcendent vision of a holy people creating a just society of sacred personalities. He gives them such truth, uplifting moral truth, and their response is, yeah, but why can't we have hamburgers and chops and steaks and the
I know.
I know, but so here's my question, a very serious question, okay? The light, can the light penetrate through those layers of the human soul to really reach that part of us which will be enlightened by it, which will be illuminated by it, which will be uplifted by it? Or is the writer of Sefer Bamidbar, is the voice of the book of Numbers telling us it's a futile process? You're dealing with people who are never going to be capable of seeing themselves in that light.
Well, that's the great question. It's the ultimate question. And the way I frame it is, it's Hobbes versus the Bible. You have to decide what is true for you about people. Either Hobbes's vision of what we're like, which is homo hominis lupus, each man is the wolf of his neighbor. We're essentially hostile, Lord of the Flies, aggressive, disgusting animals. Or is the Bible right? Anishamat shenatata li torahi, the soul you have given me, God, is pure in the rabbinic teaching. Which is true? Are we essentially divine creatures, or are we essentially vermin, hostile, wolf-like vermin? And the best answer to that is this Cherokee legend I've taught 100,000 times, where the chief takes his grandchildren out, puts them on a rock, and says, "My children, there's a war inside me between two wolves, and one is the wolf of goodness, and the other is the wolf of jealousy. And they fight every day." And one grandchild asked the chief, "So, Grandpa, which wolf will win?" And he looks at him and he says, "Well, the wolf that will win is the wolf you feed." And I think that's the answer to your question, Ed. The answer is, we don't know whether we are capable of receiving the Torah. That's why Sinai isn't in normal time. That's why we celebrate Shavuos every year. It's a way of reminding us that the decision about the Torah is always pending. But we can feed the right wolf, and we can believe in the goodness of people. I ask people to test themselves on this so that it isn't so abstract. I say, when you listen to the news and you hear about some terrible incident of, some child who was shot or something, and then you listen to the news and you hear a story of someone who saved someone else, excuse me, say, which story surprises you most? Which story surprises you most? The story about human venality and cruelty, or the story about human kindness and goodness? So in answer to your question, Ed, it's the answer of whether we're able to accept the Torah depends on how you and I answer that question in our own lives, and how we teach our children to answer that question, and what wolf we feed.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful answer. It's a wonderful. Well, it's hopeful. I mean, the
Yeah.
corollary to the question, of course, is, watching I don't want to get into the current events. This is a Torah conversation, but you watch the news each night and you ask yourself the same basic question. Given the opportunity to create a just society, and given the opportunity to shape sacred personalities, what wins? Which wolf, as it were, which side of the human soul ends up winning? And sometimes it's very difficult to maintain hope and vision. And that's what this book of Bamidbar is really about. It is a book of Bamidbar. It is a book of the wilderness, because you're not going to live your life at the foot of Mount Sinai. You're going to live your life in the real world with real people. And in the real world with real people, can we maintain a light? Can we be a light? Can we maintain a light? Can we find a way to bring us together? Can we find a way to penetrate the darker sides of the human soul with this wonderful message that you can be more than that? You can be a godly people. And that's, I think, really the question that this Torah portion presents to us. It begins with the lighting of the menorah. It includes the silver trumpets. There's also a hearing metaphor as well. And then it offers us this picture of just the disintegration of a community and the dissipation of its vision, of its idealism. And as you reach the end of the Torah portion, it's Oif Vezmir. It's like, what happened to us? Where are we? And is Moses going to have the wherewithal to carry this people to freedom? Or is he just going to give up and go back to Midian? Because at the end, the poor guy has just gotten beat up. You have a sense of the poor man just gets beat up by this people, right?
Yeah.
And that's the last question I'll present to the Torah portion, which is, so who leads this people? And what does it take to lead a people from the darker side of the character through the wilderness to a promised land? What does it take to lead a people? And what qualities does it take to lead people in that direction? Who lights the menorah, Marc? Who lights the menorah?
That's a wonderful question. And I think the answer is we have to be led by our own internal lights. We can't be led by outside leaders. In other words, it's like what de Tocqueville said, and Adams as well, that the American Constitution would not work unless it was a constitution for people who were already moral and spiritual. And I think that's the idea here, that we tried getting free by having Moses as our leader, God as our leader, the Joshua and the judges as our leaders, always an external person. I think one of the beautiful things about Hasidism is that it kind of turned Judaism on its head and said, no, and mysticism does this as well. You are the source of the leadership. You are the source of the direction. You have to lead yourself and find the light within yourself, and find a way to believe in the goodness of other people. And that's the leadership that ultimately matters. I learned this in Buddhism as well. It's you purging yourself of attachments to despair, and you deciding that you will embark on a path of kindness and forgiveness, hope and love.
That's a nice way to stop. Well, thank you, Marc. I wish you a very good Shabbos.
You too, my friend.
Stay warm and stay well. And thank you to everyone who listens, and we'll see each other. Have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbat. We'll see each other next week. Take care.
Shabbat Shalom, my friend.